particularly exciting to be back on Special Topics Thursdays. Um, Indeed, I believe that was in 2019 that I last presented, which was before we knew how to do this internet meeting. So that was actually in person, but here we are. So I'm going to go ahead and start to set up my screen. Just bear with me for a moment. Okay, can you all see that? Looks good, Laura.
Looks good.
And make sure I can see the audience. Great. Okay, well, yeah, I'll just quickly also make a acknowledgement that I'm here in Kitsilano in the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. And yeah, I share that sentiment as you, Laura. The sort of this spirit of gratitude for being able to be here on this land and learn about it. I've spent a great deal of time exploring the forests and ecosystems around here, as I'm sure many of you have, and really learning about the history and the stories that run through this land and have run through this land for hundreds and even thousands of years really enriches my sense of place and sense of meaning. So you'll see a little bit of that in the talk this evening. And yeah, and you know, since 2019, since the time that I started my PhD, it's been a very interesting time for the forests of BC. We've seen unprecedented wildfires in multiple years. We've seen social conflict and protesting erupt over old growth forests on Vancouver Island, and some dramatic shifts in policy as well. Um, so it's a really important time that we think about how we're, you know, managing and also conserving our forests and kind of taking stock of how we got into these situations in the first place. So my talk today kind of weaves together a little bit of history, a little bit of ecology, and it's all sort of pointed towards this goal of getting us to think about sustainability and what it's going to take to ensure our forests remain healthy in the long run. So um, Laura already gave a little bit of background about myself. I'll just mention a few things to give you a better sense of my own sort of position and also privilege. I've spent an awful long time in university now. Um, I guess sort of 14 years, which is unbelievable. And I'm now a postdoc at Simon Fraser University. And the reason that I went back to university, I actually worked in construction for a number of years after I finished my high school, but I decided to go back to university because I was very concerned about our environment and our forests. And so when I went back to university, I did a lot of kind of different activism and volunteering. And one of the big things has really been around old growth forests and trying to communicate their importance. So I started this website, the Vancouver Big Tree Hiking Guide, and I've also been chairing or involved in the BC Big Tree Committee. And we manage a citizen science or community science database of the largest trees in the province. And I've also had lots of different work experiences and now recently got my RPF. So I, you know, want to acknowledge my privilege as a white male who's spent most of his life in the city, who's somewhat sheltered from these changes that we see occurring in our forests. And also note that even though I grew up in the city, I've spent a lot of time exploring this province. I've worked as a carpenter, I've been an activist, and I've also worked as a forester. So I've kind of got a diverse, broad perspective of the forests, which doesn't mean I still don't have some of my own biases. But in general, my focus now is trying to kind of overcome those biases and think about our landscapes as these complex dynamic systems and really try to carve out space to accept all the different perspectives that different people have of the forest, and really just figure out what we need to do to stay resilient and make sure that our forests and other ecosystems are resilient and healthy in the long run. And that is a very complex challenge. So today I'm going to kind of hit on three major experiences of this. I'm actually going to start by reflecting on my early motivations and where I first engaged with conservation. I'm then going to present one chapter from my master's degree, where I studied the multiple ecosystem services provided by forests on Vancouver Island. That was at McGill. And then I'm going to touch on one chapter from my recently completed PhD that looks at how our forests are changing over a historical time frame, and also looks at how our institutions, like the BC Ministry of Forests, are changing alongside. That's kind of this key question of sustainability, is are we keeping pace with the scale of environmental change around us? So the story begins taking us to Meares Island on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And of course, this is set in the coastal temperate forests of Western North America, forests that receive enormous amounts of precipitation. And as a result, they tend not to have these large stand-replacing wildfires that forests elsewhere in British Columbia have. So the forest kind of just gets older and older through time, and it eventually develops into these old growth forests after several hundred years. And we find this incredible complex structure in old growth forests. We find these large trees, these large dead standing trees, accumulations of woody debris, so fallen trees on the forest floor, and also a great variety of different size trees and ages, and a diverse and abundant understory plant community. So we have this very complex vertical structure to old growth forests as well. And I got to experience these forests and really get to know them on Meares Island, which is where you'll find some of the most incredible old growth forests in BC. So this is a photo of a trail building trip that was organized by the Western Canada Wilderness Committee in 2011. And here we are, this diverse and interesting group of mostly volunteer trail builders, and we're at Sisyphus Bay. And the reason that we're there is we're there to help the Tloquit First Nation in building trails and restoring trails in support of their self-declared tribal park. So their tribal, they declared this land, this island, which they've inhabited for thousands of years, as a tribal park in 1984. And this cabin that's behind us here connects us to the story of when that tribal park was established in 1984. So essentially, the government of British Columbia had issued a license for a forest company to log, clear cut most of Meares Island. But the Tloquit First Nation had used the forests and ecosystems on that island to sustain their culture and well-being since time immemorial. So they fundamentally did not agree with the short-term profit model that the government was proposing for their island. And they were not against any form of use because they had relied on harvesting things from the forests throughout their existence, but they fundamentally disagreed with this motion from the government to clear cut it. So they allied with environmental groups such as the Friends of Clayoquot Sound, and they physically blockaded the logging company from landing on their island. And this is some photos of the protests here, and also some photos giving us a sense of the ways that they use the materials of this forest. So the interesting thing that happened here in 1984, which is quite significant in the history of British Columbia, is that when the logging company went to get an injunction to remove the protesters from blockading the road, the courts actually sided with the protesters. The courts basically said that the government of British Columbia has made a commitment to resolve these land disputes with First Nations people and broader concerns about the environment. And so they said that this is not the business of the courts to resolve this problem, and they put it back to the province and said, you guys have to sort this out. So Mears Island was not logged, and it exists today with some of the largest trees in the province, such as this one seen here, which I visited with my brother and my girlfriend, family several years ago. And it's an incredible place to visit. The ecosystems there remain relatively intact, still providing habitat for all the diverse critters and providing water not only to the villages that live on the island, but also to the village of Tofino. This photo is actually taken from Tofino looking over at Mears Island. And it also continues to sustain the culture and traditions of the First Nations people who have lived there since time immemorial. So the outcome for Mears Island is good. This is an example of where conservation is working. It's protecting the ecosystems, the biodiversity, but it's also supporting the needs of the people who've called that home for a long time. However, the process of achieving that was not a good model of conservation. It was a conflict-intensive model. And even after 1984, the protests returned again in 1994, and it took quite a battle before this area finally now appears to have some actual recognition and protection. So logging stopped on Mears Island in 1984, but only after a great deal of the old growth forests on Vancouver Island had already been logged off, and leaving places like Mears Island as, you know, one of these remaining special places. And even after the logging stopped in 1984 on Mears Island, it continued on most of the rest of the island, and it very much continues today, although there has been some recent shifts to halt logging. So in my master's degree, I had just finished my undergrad at UBC and learning a great deal about the importance of forests and also about policy. And it kind of stuck with me that, the reason we're cutting down these old growth forests is because we don't understand their value. We don't have a framework to look at them and see their value and make decisions that that might not see them being cut down, but conserved or some balance thereof. So in my master's degree, I developed a method to go into a forest like this one and try to measure the value in quantitative terms. So we measured the structure of the forest and used those measurements to identify these different ecosystem services, like large trees that have cultural heritage values, those dead standing trees and woody debris that provide habitat to lots of different critters, and also store incredible amounts of carbon. It's not uncommon for forests in this part of the world to store more than 1,000 tons of carbon per hectare, which is incredible on a global scale. There's also a great diversity of understory plants that provide medicines and wild edible berries, and certain structural attributes like those large branches that we find in these large trees, which is where marbled murrelets and a threatened bird species nests. And of course, we also measured the potential of the forest to provide timber so that we could look at all these values kind of through the same lens and think about, holistically, the broad set of values provided by the forest. And it's only in these really old forests as well that we find these large Western red cedar trees used in First Nations carving. So, we recognize this whole bundle of ecosystem services. And then the question was, what would be the impact to them? And how long would it take them to recover if we cut down the old growth forests? So we answered this question by measuring these forest plots across a broad gradient of different forest ages. And all of these forests have roughly the same ecosystem condition. So the assumption that we made in this experimental design is that the main difference between all these different forest stands is really the age at which they were harvested or disturbed by. And I'm just going to present the summary result of what we found. And so basically, right after the forest was logged, we actually have a fairly large amount of the coarse woody debris materials, at least in the plots that were measured in this study. And that's because there's a lot of slash and debris that was left over from logging. And over time, this actually decreases as we start to see an increase in carbon storage, wood volume, and dead tree biomass. After 100 years, these ecosystem services have roughly recovered after 100 years. But it's not until around 125 years or more that we really start to see any recovery of the marbled murrelet habitat. And after 150 years, we start to see some recovery of those large heritage trees. But across the entire 200 years of plots that we looked at, we didn't see any meaningful recovery of those large western red cedar trees. So overall, when we log an old growth forest through this perspective, we see an impact on a variety of different ecosystem services. And these impacts really persist. They persist for decades for some services, but really might be quite permanent for some other of these values. And of course, when you think about how land management really works, we have to acknowledge that once the old growth forest is harvested, it will be left to regrow for roughly 80, maybe 90 years before it's then harvested again. It's now entered a sort of forest management harvest rotation. So many of these values will never recover at that location. And if we convert our entire landscapes of old growth forests into these managed stands, we're essentially excluding a number of important values from the landscape. So this study opened up lots of questions and discussion, different ways to start thinking about this, like, can we preserve some of these values if we're more careful about how we log? So instead of clear-cut harvesting all of the structure, maybe we can retain some of these large trees, some of these structural attributes that are particularly important. But sometimes we might also have to, outright conserve some old growth forests if we want these values to persist on the landscape. And in the second chapter of my thesis, we actually measured not only different forest ages, but we also compared a lowland riparian forest against an upland forest type and compared the different bundles of ecosystem services provided by each. So that was sort of, this work was sort of a proof of concept to show that, we could invest a little bit more effort and do a fairly high resolution inventory of multiple different values on the landscape. And then think about that as we're developing our plans for harvesting or for conservation to try to make sure that we're retaining, some of these areas with the highest ecosystem services and really making an informed decision about how we plan and manage our landscapes. And so this was back in 2016, and the literature and my perspective has evolved quite a bit. I increasingly recognize that it's not just about measuring the ecosystem. It's equally important to think about the people that interact with these landscapes. And, ideally, in making our management plans and decisions, we should really be thinking about, the biophysical capacity of the forest to provide ecosystem services, but also thinking about, where on the landscape are people interacting with the forest? What are the things that they really value the most? And are those values, something that could be substituted with a forest at a different location? Like maybe somebody hiking could go to a different hiking trail. But there is also some values that are very place-based. So if somebody's been living in that landscape for their whole life, for multiple generations, it's It's just intrinsic to the value is that particular location. So, so I haven't had a chance to apply this exactly in BC, but I did in Indonesia at an internship I did at the Center for International Forestry Research. And so we went to these local communities and we created focus groups to actually ask people, what are the different ecosystem services? So from this whole list along the right that are important to you in your local landscape. And we asked them, which are the ones that you value the most? So that's this top panel, and giving us a sense that these people really value smallholder agriculture and timber and fish from the rivers. And then we also asked them, which ones do you desire to have more of in your landscape? And which ones do you actually use? So we got them to map the locations of where they actually use them. And what we found is that in this pre-frontier landscape, so this is a landscape that's quite intact, quite a lot of natural old growth forests, and people survive through subsistence on that forest. We found that what they value and desire is quite similar to what they use, actually. But when we did the same study further along at a location where roads had been built, where people had started to transition from forest subsistence to reliance on agroforestry, so growing some crops, but also still surviving on forests, we start to see a little bit of disconnect where some of the ecosystem services they value are no longer used in the landscape. And then when we looked in a landscape that really had quite intensive agriculture, we found a pretty dramatic disconnect. So interestingly, people still valued a similar set of ecosystem services as they did in the natural area, but the ones that they had access to had dramatically shifted. So, they still had access and use of rubber, which is harvested from the rubber tree, but they no longer had access to fish from the rivers and a variety of non-timber forest products, which they still desired. So when we combine that social perspective, we develop a more compelling case for where we should be conserving our forests. And in the final chapter of this talk, which is also the longest, I'll present the first chapter for my PhD. My PhD was titled Historical Dynamics of Ecosystem Services and Their Social-Ecological Drivers in British Columbia, Canada. And really, my approach was to look at the landscapes of British Columbia as a dynamic social ecological system. So looking at changes in the ecosystem, looking at changes in people, and what's the intersection of how our environment and our people are changing together. And I will say that most of my thesis was actually studying ecosystem services and trying to quantify changes in the ecological provision of different services, and also looking at the social dynamics of how demand for ecosystem services were changing. But what I want to focus on today is this really interesting third part of the system, which is the institutions that kind of govern our landscapes. And I'll define institutions here as the rules and norms that affect how and also by whom landscapes are stewarded. And so that includes institutions can include rules set in policy and legislation, but also norms about who has the privilege responsibility to make those decisions and create those policies in the first place. And I'll define that a little bit more as we go. So the interesting research gap that I really wanted to try to address was, so we know roughly how institutions can drive changes in the ecosystem. Like we create policies that allow old growth harvesting that causes changes in the ecosystem. But we don't know that well how changes in the ecosystem feed back through monitoring of ecological change and communication with the public to affect how institutions change. And from a historical perspective, we kind of expect them to change together and co-evolve. but there hasn't been a lot of research that's looked at that. So to answer this question, I'm just going to go back for a second and take a step back and frame the broader sort of problem framing of forest management in British Columbia. So this is from my thesis. And what I said in my dissertation is that we're struggling with these land management trade-offs in British Columbia, where we're affecting biodiversity and multiple ecosystem services as we move to, focus more on economic products like timber, which is why we're harvesting our old growth forests. And these land management trade-offs are either not well recognized and understood. We don't have that data that I just showed you that puts it into context, or we kind of know what's going on, but it's just the status quo and it's accepted. It's sort of like a necessary cost of doing business. So it's accepted by those in power. But it's also more complicated because the historical origins of, our policies and the ways that we look at forests are not well understood. And it's possible that, our policies that we live with today were developed under very different environmental conditions. So they were developed at a time when there was plentiful old growth forests, but that's a very different baseline. Those baselines have shifted today. And then the other key thing is that it's difficult for us to really think about legacies that we're creating and also think about lags. So what I mean by lags is like, in particular, we've been very good at suppressing fires in British Columbia. And we've been doing that for 150 years and very effective at it since the 1950s onwards. But we didn't expect that putting all those fires out was going to create this enormous buildup of fuel on the landscape. So it was a lagged phenomenon. And now these current wildfire seasons, they're partially caused by climate change, but they're also largely caused by this lagged buildup of fuels as the result of our fire suppression policies. So this is complex, and we need to be looking for and monitoring these lags. And then finally, the last key part of the challenge, as I see it, is that these challenges are just going on and on again. So, we had protest over old growth forests in 1984, again at Clayoquot Sound in 1995, and we see that again in 2020 at Fairy Creek. And that's because the systems that created these challenges in our environment are largely persisting today. They haven't necessarily transformed in a dramatic way. So the Ministry of Forests that exists today is maybe not that much different than, the Ministry of Forests and the power structures that were over 50 years ago. And so based on this sort of problem framing as I see it, I tried to define in my own terms what sustainability is. And I defined it as a dynamic process of stewarding landscapes. So it's a dynamic process. It's not an end state. It's not something that we call sustainable. It's this dynamic process that's guided by an inclusive recognition and monitoring of diverse social and ecological values. But not only that, it also has to be coupled with an adequate societal response that can ensure persistence of those values into the future. And what do I mean by an adequate societal response? So I'm going to define two terms here. Adaptation refers to incremental changes in a prevailing system, such as modifying existing rules to forest harvesting, whereas transformation implies breaking down the constrained pathways that our systems have evolved along and building alternative systems that are much more inclusive of diverse populations and their values, also knowledge systems and ethics. And I will say at this point that there's a very broad literature and consensus from scientists all over the world that we need transformation right now. So to address this research gap, which I already stated, it's this question of how landscapes and institutions co-evolve, I had to break the concept of an institution into multiple different parts. So we're going to recognize the institutional structure, which defines the overall relationships between people and between people and ecosystems. So basically, who creates rules, who has access to resources, and what are those power dynamics like about how together as a society we make decisions about our ecosystems. And then also institutional functions. So these are the management frameworks and policies that are created by those in power to achieve their goals. So, forest management policies or land use planning processes. And then there's also institutional processes. So these are the actual actions that are taken out, such as harvesting, fire suppression, and planting trees that cause changes in the ecosystem. And then finally, a fourth process is this activity of monitoring. So this important role of monitoring changes in the environment around us and learning so that we could, in theory, trigger changes when needed in our institutional functions or structure. And so the question that we asked, one of the questions is, how have the structure, function, and processes of BC forestry institutions changed through time and space in British Columbia? And the method to answer that was to basically do a historical inventory of the key characteristics of each of these components across 6 historical time periods. So this figure on the right is kind of showing like 6 different periods. And I'm also illustrating this possibility of these ecological legacies transferring from one period to the next, and also legacies embedded in our institutions. So there was another question centered around what these legacies and lags look like. And if that's not clear, I'll give another way to think about it. So we can think about this as hypotheses of what we expected. So under one hypothesis, we expected that, institutions can monitor the landscape, they can acquire information, and then they can readily adapt and transform as they need to keep in pace with environmental challenges. So that's kind of our close coupling hypothesis. And the second hypothesis, which is very different, says that no, institutions cannot do that. They tend to be path dependent. They're stuck in a path. So they're dealing with these historical legacies and lags and feedbacks. They're really constrain their ability to acquire information that's unbiased and then to adapt and transform as they need to. So this is kind of, and obviously that first hypothesis would be the one that would probably be more sustainable. So I'm going to show you guys what we found. And first, I'm going to point out that this figure is really just a historical timeline from 1840 over to 2020. And then I'm showing the different social ecological relationships across those 6 historical eras. And I'll just direct your attention over to the left, where we see that in the pre-colonial era, there was many First Nations. In fact, there would have been over 200 First Nations in BC, and they were directly interacting with and connected to all of these different resources in the ecosystem. And then after colonization, we see the insertion of the colonial provincial government, which essentially asserted itself as having the sole decision-making authority over all land and resources in the province. So they kind of positioned themselves in the middle of these relationships and came to control them. And then as we move forward, we don't see a terrible amount of change. We see that things are fairly stable. The provincial government stays at the center of governing these relationships between people and the environment. But we do see in the 1970s some important increase in diversity of the actors. So we see environmental non-governmental organizations show up on the scene. And in particular, such as through using blockades or boycotting, organizing boycotts around BC forest products, they're actually able to carve out some power and influence decision-making. And then really importantly, we see First Nations start to become reconnected to these resources. And that's something that's been arising since the 1970s through case law that's increasingly recognized that First Nations never relinquished their rights and title to the resources and the land of the province. So we see this interesting transformation happening in recent times, but overall institutional structure has been remarkably stable, and that has kind of constrained change. This next slide is showing changes in institutional functions. And again, this is really just a historical timeline, but I've organized it in a spiral because I want to emphasize how early functions set early on have remained at the center of our institutional systems. So in particular, in 1858, when the colony was established, there was an explicit goal that the colony would fund itself based on revenue collected from the resource industry in the province. It was agreed upon that the colony would not receive money from England, but that it would fund itself through developing the resource industry. So in the so after that, we see a formalization happening where the provincial colonial government is trying to invigorate resource industries, such as through creating tenures, which are agreements that give forest companies the rights to harvest timber. And then a really interesting thing happens. So this is quite really, disorganized and not that formal until 1912, when finally the first Forest Service is created in 1912. And it was created kind of at a fortuitous time, you might argue, because conservation at this point in time was a key kind of discussion occurring across North America. So this was the era of President Roosevelt in the States. He was creating national parks all over the place in the United States. We were doing a little bit of the same in Canada. There was a commission of conservation, which conducted the first ever inventory of forests in the province. So there was this kind of conservation mindset at the time when our institutions really formalized. But a key point I want to make is that the conservation mindset at the time was not about biodiversity. It was not about resilience. It was really inspired by what we had seen in Eastern Canada and in Michigan and also in California, where companies had gone in and logged all the forests very quickly and depleted the resource, and that had resulted in economic collapse. So the conservation mindset here was really about making sure that we use those resources wisely so that we don't quickly liquidate them, within the first decades, but that we are thinking long term. So that's important, but it was still a very utilitarian mindset. It was really about how humans can benefit from nature. And one of the things that is really noteworthy is this disdain for wildfire, and also insect outbreaks as this agent that was damaging otherwise good timber. So in this kind of conservation mindset of, we can use this resource for the betterment of society, these natural disturbances were seen as something terrible. And of course, we know today that although natural disturbances can be bad, they're also a very important part of our ecosystems. So when the BC Forest Service was first created, they had three goals. One was to suppress wildfire. The second was to reduce wood waste. And then the third was to ensure that the forest is regenerating for future harvesting opportunities. And then fast forward to 1948, we enter the era of sustained yield forestry in BC. So essentially these principles of wise use or utilitarian conservation were formalized into sustained yield that included going out and monitoring the forest, taking inventory of how much timber was available, and also modeling, trying to create a quantitative understanding of its productivity. And then also using tree planting and other silvicultural techniques so that we could have this kind of annual allowable cut, this control over how much timber was harvested. And the goal was really to ensure that there was a perpetual, continuous supply of timber, kind of like we would expect from a farm. And I'm going to try to share a video now that gives us a perspective about what the BC Forest Service was thinking during this era of sustained yield.
Again. For generations, these wilderness forests have been ravaged by fire, disease, insects, wind, and storm. There are mature forests, new forests, fast-growing forests, and old decadent stands, decaying faster than they grow. The long-range goal of the British Columbia Forest Service is to bring all these varying forest stands under scientific management on a sustained yield basis, so that in time the whole of the province's timberlands will become a great tree farm.
Yeah, so that's, and I realize that for us as, some of us as ecologists, that might seem quite shocking, but that's sort of that was sort of the vision at the time, and it was, you know, from what I understand from one paper I was reading, is that it was quite widely accepted by the public. This idea of creating tree farms was seen very positively. It was also set in sort of post-war boom era, when there was a great deal of prosperity and jobs. So there was a general sense of enthusiasm of this scientific, science-based approach to managing the forest landscapes. And we'll return to whether, that was a good idea in a bit. But first I want to show what this actually looked like. So the Forest Service didn't just create the policy, they actually became the developers of timber. So these maps are showing roads that were built by the BC Forest Service across the province. So starting in 1952, you can see their first roads were built in the Kootenays and then a little bit up north. And then you can kind of scan along with your eyes and just get a sense of the fact that the Forest Service was building roads into these previously very remote, inaccessible places. They were surveying the timber, and then they were basically auctioning off tenures, which would give logging companies the rights to harvest the timber from these areas for a very long time into the future. And we can look more closely at a few of these landscapes. So we've got, this is one of the licenses centered around Whistler on the left and Kamloops in the middle, and then the town of Mackenzie on the right. And the different colors on the landscape are just showing us the year that forests were harvested. So we kind of get the sense that, roads were built into these areas, and then logging would kind of progress, starting in the valley bottoms where the best timber was, and then move further away and up into higher elevation. And then the graphs below are kind of interesting because it makes the link between institutional function, which in this case is the annual allowable cut, so the amount of timber that was calculated as sustainable to harvest annually. So that's represented by the red line. And it's kind of jumpy because this is based on decisions that are made every 5 to 10 years. And then we see how the actual amount of timber harvested, the blue line, is really embedded in those decisions. So it shows us how, a broader historical planning and then decisions lead to actions actually carried out on the ground. And so, yeah, this figure is showing the timber harvesting. That's one of the processes. The other important process was fire suppression. So this graph is showing us the amount of forest that's burned annually since 1920. It's an incredible data set that we have this. at first based on aerial photography and aerial surveys from airplanes, and more recently based on satellite imagery. But what we see is we see this decline in the amount of fire from historical times. And in particular, since the sort of 1960s, we see almost no fire on the landscape. So, you know, once we had roads built into those areas, we had timber companies with vested interest in harvesting that timber in the long term. And we also had fantastic technology and machinery that was capable of putting fires out. Helicopters and water bombers. For a very long time, we largely extinguished the fires from a large part of the province. And of course, the effect that that has had is it removes this natural and very important process, because most of the forests in BC are fire adapted. For example, this is kind of like an interior Douglas fir forest where normally there's many small fires that burn through the understory, but they don't kill these large trees. So you end up with this very complex forest landscape that has, some small areas that are burned, some areas that are intact, some large trees. It's a very complex, heterogeneous environment that overall is quite good for biodiversity. And it's also quite resilient to the next forest. What you don't want is a very continuous forest where the fuel is connected, because that allows the fire to move through it very efficiently, and it's very hard to control. So, we kind of know that we interrupted fires. That's not my research that shows that, although it contributes to it. But a lot of different lines of evidence show this halt in fire. But what we don't know is how it has really transformed our landscape. So one of the big things I did in my PhD was to try to reconstruct these changes on the landscape. And this is showing a photo of a fantastic research assistant, Kevin, who scanned 150 historical maps of forest cover from 1958, showing the whole province. And then we brought those digital maps into a geographic information system where we georeferenced it, and we're actually able to produce a spatial map of the forest in 1958. And so this figure is comparing the forests of 1957 to 2022. And the color is showing us the percent of mature forests relative to the total area. So the light areas, the yellow is an area that has quite old forest. So as we would expect along the coast in 1957, it's mostly old forest, with the exception of areas close to Vancouver and the east coast of Vancouver Island, where there had already been a lot of logging by then. And the interior has a low percentage of mature forest, has a lot of these blue areas, blue or sort of pinkish hues. So these areas are fire adapted landscapes that historically didn't have very old forests, actually. They had some, but anywhere that fire was frequently returning, there was not a great deal of old forests. Fast forward to 2022, and we see that a lot of those yellow areas on the coast are now orange, pink, even this dark purple. So that's indicating the loss of mature forests on the coast, which is pretty much what we expect. But what's more interesting is what happens in the interior is we actually see the landscape seems to be getting older, becoming more yellow and orange. So that is showing us the effect of fire suppression, causing the landscapes on average to get older. So there's a lot of timber harvesting happening in that area, but a lot less than would have been occurring historically from fire. And overall, the effect is that it's kind of homogenizing the forest age structure of the province. So whereas we used to have a lot of old forests on the coast and young forests in many parts of the interior, it's all kind of blending together at this point, which is fascinating. But it's exactly what we expect, because that was the vision of sustained yield. That is showing us the success of sustained yield forestry. However, we also see a big blob of orange, and that's where like the mountain pine beetle outbreak has happened. And we see some blobs of purple in the south Okanagan, where enormous fires have happened. So that's also showing us simultaneously sustained yield achieving its aim, but also sustained yield at the same time failing because it did not account for those effects, which is incredible. And this will all be published soon, hopefully. So what happened when the forest got older? We built up fuels. Suddenly in 2003, fires started getting bigger, and they've gotten bigger and bigger since. In 2017, we had an unprecedented wildfire year, which was surpassed only by 2018, 1 year later, and then surpassed, or 2021 was another incredible year with a huge amount of wildfire. And then our previous summer, in fact, is not shown on this figure, but it's double of what we saw in 2017 and 2018. So it really emphasizes that we are in a different era, quite different than what our policies were designed around a long time ago. And the sort of notion of sustained yield and a continuous supply of timber just appears incredibly outdated. However, back to our timeline, sustained yield very much continues today. So in the late 1970s, we started to see some environmental forestry practices, and then we saw some very good environmental forestry practices starting in 1995 with the Forest Practices Code, which has evolved into the Forest and Range Practices Act. Arguably quite very progressive forestry practices. But the key thing that I am trying to illustrate on this figure is not just the spiral, how we're kind of spiraling around these early decisions, but that these new decisions are effectively layered on top of the old ones. So we can see balanced use forest management adds another layer to the institutional architecture of the province, but it does not actually replace sustained yield. It does not replace our obsession with eliminating fire. It does not replace our fundamental utilitarian view of the forest as an ecosystem to exploit for economic gain. And these early functions have persisted even though we're experiencing crisis since 2003. So we're seeing rising mega disturbances, and we're responding by salvaging the timber. Really, we're making these adaptive changes. However, I do note that there is the possibility of a potential transformative pathway splitting off from our current pathway. And I don't show it on this figure, but I would argue that the Great Bear Rainforest in the central and north coast of BC is already on that pathway, already showing us what that might look like. But overall, institutional functions changed every 10 to 30 years, but they tended to layer on top of one another over time. So that is the key point to take away from this. We will see policies change. Do those policies fundamentally change policies that are pre-existing? Usually not. They're more specific. They're layered on top, which is very concerning. And this is just a figure to show that there's been a lot more work that I've done trying to map out this system than what I'm presenting today. But I won't go into all those details. So overall, results support this institutions are path-dependent hypothesis. There are these legacy institutional structure and functions that we've inherited from the past. Nobody creating policy today was alive when those previous policies were created. We've just accepted them into our system, and they constrain forest management today from transforming in the ways that it needs to meet emerging environmental challenges. And, it's complicated. We're also, navigating these lagged dynamics. We didn't, I don't think, know at the time that suppressing wildfires was going to cause a buildup in fuels. I mean, I think probably First Nations definitely knew that, but the systems that are in power did not know that. And so it's complicated. We really need to emphasize monitoring and learning and constantly reflecting on if the things we're doing are suitable for today. So we provided 3 recommendations to help see that system transform, as I had shown that potential pathway. The first is to monitor and manage the forests in the province more locally. And that will provide a better fit between institutions that are making decisions and the ecosystems that they're affecting in their decisions. So moving from a centralized government control to something much more dispersed. And that doesn't mean removing the provincial government, because we also need to manage broad scale processes. We need a coordinated effort across multiple spatial scales, essentially. The second is really to immediately move away from our sustained yield notion of forestry, which is completely out of touch with what we're seeing on our landscapes today, and move very quickly towards a paradigm where we're prioritizing ecosystem health and we're actively maintaining and restoring complexity in our landscapes. So kind of moving back to something that looked more like the 1957 map. And then finally, we really need to invest in the long run, socially, so to foster capacity within our institutions that can help them adapt and transform, by reflecting on, the historical policies that constrain us today, the historical privileges and power dynamics, and our tendency to rely on Western science, which struggles to keep pace in some ways with the complexity of ecosystems. And so an example of what we mean by that is, for example, in 2020, there was an old growth strategic review that took a very deep look at how we manage old growth forests in the province. And it provided pretty significant recommendations for how we need to change that. And I'll touch on that in a second. So this is from the strategic review. And yeah, some of the recommendations were pretty significant, transformative, I would say. And I'll point out the ones that I mean. And the government came out and said, yeah, we want to move forward with these recommendations. We want to break from the past when decisions led to confrontations. We want to involve environmental groups, Indigenous leaders, forest companies, labor organizations, and communities. We want to work together to protect our forests. So this is kind of, the ending note that's kind of positive. Actually, we are in this very exciting time, and those 2 recommendations from the Old Growth Strategic Review that are potentially transformative in my perspective is Indigenous involvement in all decisions. And that's transformative because it's going right back to the heart of who has the say to make decisions. And that dynamic is kind of been untouched since colonization. So this is an opportunity to really shake things up. And that's very exciting. And then the other one is kind of, as I've alluded to, rapidly moving towards prioritizing ecosystem health over timber. And I'm happy to say that the province is now creating a draft framework for what that's going to look like. It's going to be an ongoing learning process of relearning how we manage our forests, but it's a positive step. So some general takeaways across the whole talk, and then I'm going to wrap this up. It's really been kind of like a myopic focus on timber values and economic growth that's driven forest management and driven the creation of policy. So we really do need a broader awareness and inclusion of all the other values of forests. And this bias towards timber is being preserved in institutions through power dynamics, Who gets to make the rules, who has the say, and also these policies that have been around for a very long time that are not well fit to our current environmental circumstance today, and they preserve this bias for timber. And finally, as the final takeaway, we are possibly on the verge of a rare transformation. So it's really important that we think hard about where we've come from. We create that vision for what we want to transform towards. And then, yeah, finally, as the last slide, looking back on Meares Island, where we started. So this is a photo taken from one of the mountains there. I guess it's been an important landscape in the development of my own interests, and I'm really grateful for that. And I guess it sort of tells the story that it takes challenges, it takes persistence, and sometimes it takes a bit of conflict to address these systems and create the change that we need to create. But it's important. So it's not a challenge that we can shy away from. It's something that we have to figure out. We have to figure out how to manage our forests and take care of them, conserve them, steward them, however perspective you like to think about that. We need to ensure that forest stays green and healthy. So with that, thank you very much, Nature Vancouver. It's always a pleasure. And I do want to thank my PhD supervisor, Janine Remtula, and our lab, my committee members, and all my co-authors. Also, the supervisors for my master's were Sarah Gergel at UBC and Elena Bennett at McGill. The Western Canada Wilderness Committee for getting me out there. And also the Taloquay First Nation from Meares Island. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.